The final regular season road trip for the Milwaukee Brewers of the 2025 season. They went 2-4. It doesn't matter. Playoff spot is locked up. They're almost certainly going to have the 1 seed. In fact, they might already have it by the time that you're listening to this. So everything's okay. We're going to break down really quickly what happened this weekend. But more importantly, we're going to start looking ahead to the National League Division Series on this week's edition of the Brewer Fanatic podcast, hosted by Jack Stern and my co-host, Spencer Michaelis. Spencer, I was told by you about 2 minutes before we started that you're pretty tired today. So I could ask you how you're doing, but I think I know what the answer is going to be.
Yeah, the answer is very, very tired. I just, for some reason, could not get any sleep last night, and then it was a long day at work. So, like I told you, I'm going to find the energy for this, and then as soon as we're done, I'm going to be going to sleep and hopefully getting some catch up on the hours I missed last night. But everything else is great. Just very tired at the moment.
Well, we'll jump into all that and get through all this info that we have for the final full week, I guess, of the regular season to cover here. Brewers are going to have one more home series over the weekend that we'll talk about. But before we jump into all of that, I do want to thank Ryan Top from Milwaukee Tailgate. He filled in for me last week because I was busy on the last homestand because they had a Thursday night game. So thank you, Ryan, for filling in admirably. It's really not that hard. It's a pretty low bar to clear when you're trying to put yourself in my shoes, but that's okay. We did it. He did it. It was a good show. But let's jump into the week in review here. So, like I said, the Brewers went 2-4 between their 3-game series in St. Louis and then San Diego. Again, not really a lot to draw from this at this point. Your goal is to just balance this last week or so here of you don't want to let your foot completely off the gas pedal and stop playing competitively, but at the same time, these outcomes do not matter. So, for all intents and purposes, Game 1, the Brewers dropping this one by a 7-1 final. And honestly, I just said that there's not a lot to take away here. But if there is anything to take away from any of these games, it probably is this first one because Jacob Misiorowski started this game. And I said to you that, 2 earned runs in the box score does not look that bad, especially compared to some of the other outings that he's had within this stretch of his last 7. But I would argue that from a process standpoint, I think this was his worst outing. So 3 2/3 for him, 5 hits, 2 earned runs, 3 walks, 3 Ks. I didn't put it in the notes. I believe there was at least 1 hit by pitch in there as well. So a lot of free bases for the Miz, a lot of deep counts again. And Pat Murphy after this one was pretty much pouring cold water on the notion of Misiorowski making playoff starts, which, he didn't go so far as to fully confirm it in those post-game quotes, but pretty much said he hasn't put himself in a position to be starting playoff games. And the Brewers, for the most part, have been pretty non-committal on what his role is going to be moving forward. And maybe that's the first domino that drops here. But we've talked plenty about why we felt that if he was going to pitch out of the bullpen in the playoffs, they probably should have started that conversion sooner. We'll see what happens from here. They pushed Quinn Priester back a day, so he's going to start on Friday. And then the Brewers do not have any probable starters listed for the rest of that weekend against the Reds at home. So we don't know if it's going to be Jacob Misiorowski starting or if they're going to do something else here and use him out of the pen this last weekend of the regular season. But what did you see, first of all, in this start? And then what are you kind of thinking here as far as what role is he going to end up in? What role should he end up in? Will he have a role on a playoff roster given where things are at right now? Like, where do you see all of this sitting?
Yeah, Ryan and I kind of talked about this last week, and it was right before this start, obviously, but I'm with you in saying that this was one of his worst process starts of the entire season, and it was definitely, for me, the worst one in the stretch of outings that I think a lot of people have been kind of hard on how he's been performing, and maybe even harder than he deserved to be on him, or giving him a little bit more grief than he probably deserved for some of the starts, because I think there was some not great luck and some things that he maybe couldn't control happening around him. But this was on him. I mean, he did not pitch well. He was all around not in the zone all over the place. Like you said, I believe he hit at least one hit batter as well in this outing. So at least 4 free passes in less than 4 innings. That's obviously not something that's going to work out very well usually. And like you said, Murph was more or less saying like that starting's probably not happening in the playoffs. And the interesting thing is in the San Diego series that we'll talk about later, like he was down in the bullpen. He wasn't sitting in the dugout for those games. He was sitting in the bullpen. So I think that gives a pretty good sign of where they want to go. But like you said, and like we talked about a number of times on here, like that's a tough adjustment for him to make and just be able to head into the playoffs and be in that role, having to this point still not even pitched out of the bullpen in the big leagues at any point. It will be interesting to see how they handle this weekend. I think that's going to, if they want him to pitch in the bullpen in the playoffs, he has to pitch out of the bullpen this weekend. Like they have to find a way to at least get him an outing and see how it looks and see if he can find a routine of some sort. But for me, and we're going to have questions about the playoff roster and especially the NLDS and all of that coming up. But I'm starting to wonder if he's actually going to be on that roster at all for the NLDS. And I would not have wondered that at any other point up until this last start and kind of Murph's comments. And now the fact that he is in the bullpen, but he hasn't been used. And I just think it'd be hard for me to see him on the roster, except for being kind of an opener type where he starts a game and it's only for one time through, something like that. Like, I don't know what role he could have outside of that at the moment, because I don't think they would trust him to make a real start. And I wouldn't trust him to go in there as a reliever without having had a little more experience in that type of role. So it kind of feels like he's got one potential role that for me makes sense. And that makes it kind of tough to envision an NLDS role. Now, that doesn't mean if they advanced, I actually think he'd be more likely to make it to the NLCS roster if the Brewers advance than the NLDS roster, because there would be more of an opportunity for one. You probably need an extra starter, which again, maybe that's the opener type role for him, or it's a split start type of thing with someone else. But I think he'd be at that point one of your healthy starters, which we'll get to in a little bit with some of the stuff that happened this week. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm looking at it. I kind of view it as more likely that he would be on a potential NLCS roster than an NLDS roster. And that's a pretty big change from where I would have been 3-4 weeks ago. And it's just kind of, unfortunately, the way he's been pitching down the stretch. And I think it should be acknowledged too that it's his first major league season. He has surpassed his career high in innings by at least 30, maybe 35, almost 40 now at this point. And I think you are seeing some of that catch up to him a little bit. And I think especially in command, not necessarily in stuff, but in command as the season kind of progresses, as he gets further beyond what he's done at any point in his baseball career, not even just in professional baseball, just at any point. The workload may have caught up to him a little bit too. So we'll see where it ends up going, but that's kind of how I'm looking at it. It seems unlikely for the NLDS to me at this point, but maybe still an option as they potentially move on in the playoffs.
I'm starting to wonder if they're going to use that NLDS to not roster him, but have him working on the side, like simulating a reliever's workload during that series, because we've talked about how, you're on short time here if you want to actually get him into that routine for the playoffs. Maybe the plan never was to use him out of the bullpen in the NLDS. Maybe the plan was either he continues pitching well enough to start in that series, or if he doesn't, he's not on the roster anyway. We're saving him for some of those deeper series if we get that far. And if that is the way they're going, I'm talking speculatively, maybe they do use that week-long series to kind of put him on that workload. Like he simulates, an inning or 2 innings or something, and then a day or 2 later, he's right back on the horse again. Because that's the hardest part of it, is having to get used to the pitching multiple times in a week, or potentially having to pitch 3 times in a series, in a 7-game series, if it gets to that for him. So it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds. But I would agree with you at this point. I don't think we're going to see him on that NLDS roster when that comes out next Friday. Finishing up the action from game one here, Rob Zastryzny and Grant Anderson had a rough fifth inning. They combined to allow 5 runs, 5 of the 7 that the Cardinals would score. And then Milwaukee on the offensive side, and what was really a theme throughout pretty much the entire week, not doing a whole lot with the bats. Their only run came on a Sal Frelick solo home run in the third. Game 2, the Brewers would bounce back with a victory. Brewers 3, Cardinals 2. Chad Patrick got the ball in this one, and kind of another Chad Patrick outing where things started strong and he couldn't really finish the outing. Although I would argue in this one, he kind of got dinked and dunked a little bit towards the end of this one, as opposed to some of these starts where it's gone third time through. Excuse me, where it's gone third time through and the contact gets a little bit louder once the lineup turns over. 4 1/3 for him in this one, 5 hits, 2 earned runs, 3 strikeouts. Aaron Ashby kind of cleaning up that fifth inning for him. Ashby would end up going 2 2/3 in this one. Did work around some traffic, 4 hits, but no runs allowed. Struck out a guy, got a key double play as well in one of those innings. Caleb Durbin and Andrew Vaughn combining in the 6th here to tie it for the Brewers. Durbin doubled and then moved over to third, Vaughn driving him in with the sac fly. And then the Brewers would send this one to extra innings. They would grab the lead in the top of the 10th on a Bryce Terang single up the middle. And then Jared Koenig joining Aaron Ashby with a multi-inning effort as a high leverage guy, going 2 perfect innings to close it out. Pitch count was very low for him, though, so it was largely a pretty low stress, quick and easy 2 innings for him. Maybe I shouldn't say low stress because you're coming in the 10th with that tying run on base. But nonetheless, he took care of business very quickly. There was a nice play in that sequence as well in that 10th inning to get that lead runner going to third base as well. Andrew Monasterio making a pretty nice play from first base after he came in as a sub. But that's how the Brewers would bounce back in this one. They would then drop game 3, 5-1. Robert Gasser making his season debut, officially back from Tommy John surgery. Potentially someone who could also kind of factor into that playoff picture. And his first start back, 3 innings, hit, 2 earned runs, 2 walks, 2 strikeouts, and a home run. Not quite as sharp as it always looked in a lot of those rehab outings, but by and large, the stuff looking how you would want it to, playing how you would want it to. Spencer, do you have any takeaways from seeing him back in the big leagues for the first time in over a year?
I mean, honestly, like you said, I thought the stuff looked good. That was the thing throughout the rehab that I kind of caught me by surprise right away, was how good, how normal the stuff looked for him. It looked like what we had seen from him in the big leagues last year, pretty much right away when he got back into the rehab starts that were at least not in Arizona, which we didn't get to see, obviously. But once they were on MILB TV, whether that was in Appleton or once we got StatCast data in AAA and we're able to watch him there, like it immediately looked like a guy who could probably come back to the big leagues and help this year. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't super sharp. I think he had a hit bat or 2 in that 3 inning stretch. So 3 free passes for him in 3 innings. But I thought generally he wasn't getting great swings. Now, obviously, Herrera connected with the 2-run homer, and that made the line look pretty bad. 2 earned in 3 innings is never going to look great. But I thought the stuff looked pretty good. And a guy like Herrera is a lefty killer who's been a good hitter this year, and he kind of just made a mistake and he took advantage of it. But I thought he looked good. I think I want to see, at least one more outing here and see how it looks this last weekend. But I think he's a guy that's going to have a pretty decent chance at holding down a roster spot in the NLDS, especially because he did get used to coming out of the bullpen a little bit in AAA and doing things in a little bit of a different role. So he's got kind of different options. You can use him in different roles in a shorter series. So I think that'll be something that the Brewers will look to take advantage of, especially if DL Hall, for example, is not ready to take that role too.
Eric Fetty also giving Gasser a little bit of length behind him here as kind of the bulk guy in this one. 4 innings for him. Only 1 hit allowed, but 3 earned runs. He walked 3 guys, had 1 strikeout. We'll talk about him a little later as well because he pitched again. You guys talked about him last week too, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe not a ton
to
rehash there. Maybe not a ton to rehash there, but he did eat some innings for the Brewers this week, kind of just doing what his job is out of that bullpen. Jackson Churio scoring or driving in the Brewers' only run in this one with a sac fly. And that was all for Milwaukee in St. Louis. They then went to the West Coast and played the Padres for a 3-game set. Game 1, they lost in walk-off fashion 5-4 in extra innings. We'll start with Freddie Peralta. He got the ball in this one. A long first inning. The Freddie inning came right away, and there was a run-scoring balk involved in that inning, and that was it, though. 5 innings for him. He would settle in 4 hits, 2 earned runs, the second one scoring on a Jose Iglesias home run. The Brewers gave up 2 home runs to him in this series when he had won the entirety of the season. But 5 innings for Freddie, 4 hits, 2 runs, a walk, 6 Ks, and then that homer. Brings us to our first question of the week. Michael Parr on Twitter asks, is this the version of Freddie you were hoping to see last year? Can he pitch even better, or is this a ceiling? So I think in terms of the results, like just runs allowed, yes, this is what we've been hoping to see. But I also don't think the process by which he's gotten there this year fully lines up with the results that, and I'm not saying he's pitched poorly. Like, we're talking about the difference between like the process of a 3.5 ERA pitcher and the results of a 2.6 ERA pitcher. Like, that's you're getting picky there for sure. But I still think by and large, like the non-competitive misses, some of the big innings once in a while, like a lot of this stuff that you feel like if he could get that out of the way, that's when you're really going to hit the ceiling. But there's probably a good chance that if he does that and then all the process stuff lines up with how he wanted to, I don't know that the results are actually getting better than they've been so far anyway. Maybe he goes deeper into some games. That's probably the only one I could think of. But I think the bottom line run prevention would be about the same.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, it's hard to ask for much better results. I mean, this is going to be, I would guess he's going to end up getting a decent amount of, down ballot Cy Young votes this year. He's definitely going to be in there, probably top 10, if not maybe settling around 5, just looking at the leaderboards for a lot of things. I think he's going to have a case to be around top 5, it's been an awesome season for him. I agree with Jack, though. I think the process, I would say in the first half of the season, the process was more what we were hoping to see a lot more often. I think we talked about it a lot to that point. Honestly, we mentioned like, hey, he's doing a lot of things that we were hoping to see improvement on. And while the results have been there in the second half, with the Brewers playing obviously incredibly well since the beginning of July, especially. So a lot of his numbers still look pretty good, but I agree that I think it's been a little bit more not repeatable the way he's doing it. Maybe he's not necessarily quite earning the results that he's got, even though he would still be earning solid results with the way he's pitching. But to answer the second part of it, can he pitch even better? Is this the ceiling? I think we'd both agree that there's more in there if he can figure some things out, what we've always talked about. If he can limit those uncompetitive pitches, if he can be a little bit more quick to put hitters away when he has the opportunity to do so, if he can go a little bit deeper in games, which I think is connected to the first two things, then yeah, like there's even a higher ceiling here than what he's showing. But just to circle back to how Jack put it, like, I don't know that would look that much different in terms of ERA, strikeouts, maybe fewer walks, maybe, fewer, just things like that maybe, the FIP might go down a little bit, but the overall ERA and the strikeouts and that type of stuff, I think would still end up looking similar to what it's been this year, especially. And it's kind of nitpicking. We've talked about it before. Even Murph has kind of said it, like, yeah, the difference between Freddie, putting guys away quickly is the difference between being that like superstar pitcher and being a very good pitcher. And I think that's where we're at with him. Like, I think there is technically another step he can take, but also at this point in his career, how likely is that step to ever be taken? I would say this is probably who he is at this point. And that's a really good major league pitcher. It's just one that can be frustrating at times because you do feel like, oh man, there's just that little bit more in there that you're hoping that he can get to. And it feels kind of unlikely we ever see that at this point.
Brewers had a 3-run second inning on offense in a very 2025 Brewers sequence. William Contreras drew a walk. Andrew Vaughn hit a single. Isaac Collins walked. Caleb Durbin hit an RBI single, and then Yelich hit a 2 RBI singles. So 3 runs scored without a single extra base hit. Just a lot of walks and a lot of singles. I do want to highlight that 2 RBI single by Yelich, though, because Collins was able to barely slide in safe because Durbin was tagged out heading to third. And as a reminder, like, because that's a tag play, because that's not a force, if you touch the plate before the tag is applied to that other runner, that run does count. And they synced up like the angles on TV, and you could see it. It was very, very close, but Collins did just get in there. So very big play in that situation too. Unfortunately, it wouldn't end up mattering a whole lot for the final result because Nick Mears coming in the 7th inning, blowing a 1-run lead, 2 walks and a base hit. I'm worried about Nick Mears, man. I think he's kind of running out of gas. He looks like a pitcher who's running out of gas. And I think where you start to see that more than anything is the walks. This is a guy who did not walk anybody in the first half. I think he had like 4 walks the entire first half. And, you know, when relief pitchers tend to tire, sometimes it's not always the raw stuff. A lot of times it's the execution and it's the control and all that kind of stuff. And I think we're starting to see that with him. So that's become an issue lately. I'm still alarmed with the results have not been awful against the fastball, but the kind of contact against it all year has not been good. So I think in that sense, he's really just got one weapon and then one not so good pitch. And there's a danger with that because number one, either guys are going to jump on that fastball, or if you start going really extreme with that slider and then you make a mistake with it, like he has in some outings as well, you know, then we've seen the really, really good pitch and that slider get punished too. So I think he's the one leverage guy in this bullpen right now who I'm still kind of on that fence of. I don't know if I would necessarily be trusting him with big outs in October. And again, that's not a reflection on the value he's given the Brewers throughout the entire season, which he's been very, very big. But he's passed a career high in innings, a career high in appearances. You're seeing some warning signs here, and it'll be interesting to see when we get into the playoffs if the Brewers are looking at those same warning signs and say, hey, maybe he's not someone who not necessarily gets left off the playoff roster, but someone who we limit him to very, very specific situations, and he's not just a general leverage guy like he's been for a lot of the year.
Yeah, I think that's something that they should look at because I'm with you. I'm concerned about him. I was hoping, you know, the IL stint, though obviously it was a legitimate IL stint. He was having back issues. I was hoping that sort of time off in terms of usage in the bullpen was going to help him maybe, you know, find a little bit of extra energy, a little juice down the stretch here. But since he's returned, it hasn't really looked any different. In fact, I'd say in some cases it's looking even a little bit worse than it did pre IL stint. So yeah, I'm with you. I mean, they've tried to reintroduce the curveball a little bit. It seems like that's just something they're trying to at least mix in once in a while to show that, hey, I do have another pitch you have to at least keep in mind. And I don't think that's the worst idea for him. I've talked about that before. Like I don't hate it. I don't think they're using it a ton, but he'll mix it in there a little bit more often lately. And I think it's just, again, pretty much to try and help with what you're talking about. Like the fastball, the more hitters see it, they're especially going to hit that pitch. And you can't show them the slider too often because then eventually they do start to see it better and start to hone in on that and just kind of, you know, then they can start to barrel the good pitch. So I'm guessing a little bit more curveball usage is a way to try and get them off of both of them, at least make them think about a pitch that could come in, you know, 5 miles per hour, slower than the slider, a little bit different shape, obviously. And more than anything, I think it's just to keep something in the back of their mind that they have to worry about a third pitch. But I'm still not sure that's going to do enough to make up for some of the other shortcomings that he's seeing right now with the stuff and with the command since he's come back, especially and as the season's winding down. So I'm with you. I don't think there's really any chance he's off the playoff roster if he is healthy. But I do think his role should be less leverage, maybe less important. Every inning's important in the playoffs, but maybe less leverage. Maybe it's a pocket of hitters that you identify, you know, struggle with sliders. You see a spot in the order against whoever the matchup is that you think he could attack, and first guy out of the bullpen in a game or something just to go after somebody. But yeah, he's not somebody I would have a ton of faith in if he did come into a spot where he needs to especially get a punch out or really just big moments in general, because I just think there's, especially with the stuff, and we've talked about it all year, and it's funny because last year I didn't think the stuff was like this and he was giving up a ton of homers. And now I think the stuff is kind of in a spot where he probably should be giving up some homers, and he hasn't given up that many of them. But it does feel like a guy who's kind of due to give up some home runs, I guess, for lack of a better term. And that always scares me with a reliever who would be coming into a playoff game, because those are the types of swings that can swing games. So, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with Mears right now.
Another guy you could probably have a conversation about regarding playoff role, Joey Ortiz. He's had a lot of rough at-bats with men on base this year, and that's kind of been an odd theme that he just comes to bat all the time with the bases loaded or a couple guys on. He came up in the 8th with this one, tie game, 2 men on base. And to put it bluntly, just an absolutely horrendous at-bat. Horrendous at-bat. He struck out on back-to-back sliders at his feet from a right-handed pitcher. Not even like competitive pitches, and he chased both of them and just kind of helpless looking swings. He has looked very, very rough offensively since he came off the injured list. The glove is still really, really good. We can kind of take this conversation into the later portion of the show here, because we did get a question about it, but an at-bat that certainly sticks out for a couple of different reasons in this one, given how it would turn out. The Brewers would scratch 1 run across in the 10th inning on the contact play, but the Padres then tying it up again off of Rob Z, bringing in that zombie runner in the bottom half of the 10th. Brewers would not score in the 11th, and then Grant Anderson came out pretty promptly, gave up the game-winning single. So the Brewers losing in walk-off fashion 5-4. Game 2, this will be a blowout in San Diego's favor. Nothing really surprising here. Bruce Zimmerman got the ball in this one, and the only goal here for Bruce Zimmerman was eat some innings, and he did that. 6 innings for him, 7 hits, 6 runs, 5 of them earned, a couple of walks, a strikeout. Really, the 2 home runs doing a lot of damage in those first 2 innings. And the second of those home runs was probably one of the cheaper home runs I think I've ever seen. Luis Arias hit an 89-mile-an-hour fly ball that basically dinked right off the bottom of the foul pole down the right field line. So, and I'm not going to use that to say Zimmerman was unlucky, because when you only strike out one guy, you're just opening yourself up to some crazy batted ball stuff sometimes. But he did what the Brewers needed him to do in this one. The only objective here was give us some innings so that we can line everything else up in a lot better spot than we otherwise would have been. And he did that. The Brewers got through this one on 2 pitchers. Zimmerman went 6. Tobias Myers covered the final 2. They only had to go 8 because they were on the road and they were trailing. So he did his job. So a veteran guy who's been perfectly solid in Nashville all year long, he got a chance, and he gave the Brewers what they needed. It was kind of reminiscent of like late season Colin Ray several years ago in his first stint with the Brewers, when he was up late in the year, and he came out of the bullpen in that outing, but just he wasn't good, but he went out there and he got a lot of outs, and that's really all the Brewers needed in this game.
Yeah, this is a guy who spent pretty much the entire season in Nashville. There was like a split. There's like a week or maybe only a few days where he had opted out of his contract, and then he re-signed right away with the Brewers on another minor league deal. So he was basically with the Sounds the entire season. He was a very good vet by all accounts, somebody who helped a lot of the younger pitchers kind of learn their way. This is a guy who had big league experience, who had kind of been there, who was able to teach some of the guys the ropes and help in that way. And also he made changes to his repertoire, and he tried to grow as a pitcher himself, and he earned his opportunity back in the big leagues, and he did what the Brewers needed him to do. Like you said, this is a guy who I think the Brewers understood that it was probably going to need to be a high-scoring affair if they were going to win with Zimmerman making the start. But especially after the first inning, for him to be able to get through 6 still and give the Brewers exactly what they needed in terms of length. And like you said, only Tobias Myers had to be used out of the bullpen like that. That's what you need from guys like that at times like this in the season. And Unfortunately for Zimmerman, that was always going to be pretty much his only role. He did end up obviously getting DFA'd after that. But he did what the Brewers needed to do. And these are the types of outings that people don't remember, and it's never going to be part of any like look back on a season and everybody's, highlighting this type of start. But these types of starts do matter over the course of a season from a guy like this. And for him, I think he did a really good job just knowing that's what the goal was, and being able to go out and at least hold up that part of the bargain and give the Brewers the length that they were needing. So I think, yeah, like I said, I don't think anyone really expected it to go super well in terms of results, but he did what they needed him to do. And it was important because it's going to help the Brewers set up how they want to set up heading into this final stretch here.
Offensively, Milwaukee shut out in this one. They managed just one hit against Padres starter Randy Vasquez. In Game 3, the Brewers would salvage one to come out of San Diego, avoiding the sweep. They would win 3-1 in Game 3, scoring one run in the 5th, 7th, and 9th innings. So Andrew Vaughn hit an RBI double in the 5th, Bryce Terang an RBI single in the 7th, and then Danny Jansen a solo shot in the 9th. Danny Jansen, by the way, is like right back to a 95 OPS plus as the backup catcher. Some of the peripherals are still not great behind that line or some of those results, but I feel like he's had some better swings of late. This is his second homer in a couple weeks here. For all the complaining that I've seen about that trade and about his production, he's in a perfectly fine spot again for what a backup catcher should be, and I would still argue has contributed a little bit more value on the field than you were probably going to get out of Eric Haas.
Yeah, threw out a runner in this game too. But yeah, I think I get it. Like when guys come over in trades, I think some people had obviously seen Yadier Arianamo's stats as well in high A, and he did pretty decently in double A for the Rays, for the record. Like we should point that out. But and I think they were kind of hoping to see more. But at the same time, when he came over, there was a thought that he was going to need to eat up some more playing time. Before the deadline, Contreras' offense was not in a very good spot. And pretty much immediately when Jansen got here is when Contreras' bat really took off results wise. So there hasn't been a ton of need for Jansen to play a lot. Obviously, we know Contreras is refusing to sit out. We saw that on this road trip. He got smoked with a bat at one point. He missed one game and then was pretty much right back in there because he refuses to sit out, and Murph is going to let that happen. So that's where we're at with that. But when Jansen's gotten opportunities lately, like you said, I think the bats come around a little bit. Just generally, I do like the way he calls a game. We haven't seen a ton of it. It's hard for me to really get into that and say that it's good for sure. But when I'm watching games, I seem to line up with the way he's calling a game pretty often. So I always like when guys are like that. And honestly, like I would say just the last few starts I've seen from him, I think he is starting to smoothen out a little bit of the receiving stuff. I thought it's looked a little bit better, not as clunky. So I think he's learning some of those things and improving on that. So yeah, I think he got a little unnecessary hates from the fan base, and I get it. Eric Haas was also just a very big fan favorite as a guy who stepped up last year and had really nice results, even if they weren't super sustainable. But I think there's still a pretty decent chance at some point here that Jansen might be a guy that ends up getting, a hit in the playoffs. That matters. Something that he could be a guy who can pinch hit and do something. And again, what we said the whole time, he's also just it's a nice insurance for if Contreras does end up getting hurt. He's more of a sure thing as a starter than what you had before. So if he ends up having to play more consistently, I think that's always going to be the thing you have to come back to. Like this is more of a sure thing as a starter, and that's important to have because you never know what's going to end up happening with a catcher.
On the pitching side, Chad Patrick got a shortened start here on short rest. 3 innings for him, 2 hits, couple of walks, 6 strikeouts. And then Eric Fetty following him again, 2 2/3, 2 strikeouts. The only run that he gave up was on a solo homer. I won't rehash the entire thing because I know you guys talked about it a lot last week, but He's been fine. I've also seen some people, I think, acting like the Brewers fixed him. I don't know that the Brewers actually fixed him. For starters, I think a lot of the pitch mix stuff was probably from facing the Angels a little bit, where they just threw a ton of cutters and sweepers to the Angels, no matter who was pitching. But it has carried over a little bit into some of his other outings, but he has been a lot more like kitchen sink in some of these other appearances. Also, he's got a 1-to-1 strikeout to walk ratio right now. Like there are no numbers whatsoever supporting that he's actually pitching better now than he was for all the other teams that he was throwing for early in the year. So I'm not on the Brewers fixed Eric Fetty train. No, and no offense to Eric
I
Fetty,
agree.
who has eaten up some innings, but like no.
Yeah. I think we should highlight the other pitcher from this outing because we talked about him twice this week, but Chad Patrick's, I would assume, done for the regular season at this point. And he finished with a 3.54 FIP and a 3.56 ERA. Strikeout rate was all the way up to 25.1% on the season, which is not that far from where it was in AAA last year. I believe it was 26. Walk rate of only 7.8%. Like we talked a lot early on that some of the process stuff and some of the peripherals maybe weren't in a great spot, but by the end of the season, like that's a really solid line, over 118 in the third innings. He added what's being tagged as a slurve. We talked about that a little bit when he first started throwing it, the pitch with more depth and more, really mostly the depth, but I do think that's been a nice pitch for him. I think it's added a little bit to the equation. Now, I think we both agree we'd still like to see a little bit more velocity taken off of it compared to the fastballs, or really compared to the cutter, I think is the one we want to see the difference there. But even like since he came back, he's been in that split shorter starts type of role. And we've seen, I mean, he hit 97 yesterday. We've seen a lot of 95, 96. Like, I think there's a role for him in the playoffs coming up here. And I don't know which one it's going to be. I assume it's probably going to be in a pen role, but I think he's going to help in the playoffs. And frankly, I think he deserves a lot of credit for really getting to a point where the results actually do match up with kind of the process and everything else. And they came out really well by the end of the season. So we were pretty hard on him early, not in like a real negative way, but just saying like, I don't know how sustainable this is. But by the end of it, a lot of stuff does actually add up and look pretty good, and looks like a guy who I think he's definitely got a future with the Brewers in some capacity, where it's going to be a pretty helpful major leaguer, whether it's out of the pen or still as a starter. I could see it going either way.
Brewers are going to need a game 3 starter. I would rather give the ball to Chad Patrick than Jose Quintana, and I don't even know if it's that close.
Agreed.
I know you have the veteran deal with Quintana, but Patrick has looked so much more competitive. It's not even close. So we'll see which route,
especially coming off the IL too. Like Quintana won't have pitched for a few weeks. Yeah,
they're gonna have a decision to make there. It's going to be interesting. That actually does kind of transition a little bit into some talk about kind of how are things going to look on the playoff roster here. Before we do that, though, we should probably just rattle off some injury updates, because that'll kind of give us a little bit of context here for some of the decisions that the Brewers have coming up. I'll run through some of the more minor ones first. Trevor McGill, he threw 2 simulated innings in the bullpen on Tuesday, about 30 pitches. He's throwing a live on Friday, and then he is going to be activated and pitch on Sunday, and then he should be ready to go for the playoffs. It seems that basically what's been going on here for McGill is he's never really shut down from throwing for more than a couple days after he first hit the IL. But he just wasn't quite bouncing back the way they wanted to after some of these lives, but he's been able to keep throwing at a pretty good intensity. So I think more than anything, they've just been being cautious here, but it has seemed for a little bit like coming back to pitch in the playoffs never seemed super doubtful. I think this kind of does feel like something that like he can pitch with. They're just being as careful as they possibly can here. And since he wasn't really making a ton of progress with the bounce backs, they just kind of kept pushing everything back. But now playoffs are around the corner, so he's going to pitch on Sunday as kind of that tune-up outing, and then they'll kind of see where things go from there. But I would imagine he'll be in the playoff bullpen. Jose Quintana, who we mentioned, he threw a bullpen with 2 ups on Tuesday as well. They haven't really said much about what his timeline looks like, but he will be eligible to be activated from the injured list for that NLDS. And if they want him to start game 3, chances are it's looking like he is going to be available for that. Because again, another guy who never stopped throwing, seems like the calf was bothering him more just with moving around a little bit or running or that kind of stuff. But he's never had to shut down from throwing, so he is good to go there. Um, so potentially an option as the Brewers are looking at that game 3. Logan Henderson threw a bullpen on Tuesday in Arizona. He could still return for October as a reliever, and then DL Hall kind of in similar territory. The last update on him was that he's staying ready in Arizona, so on call for whatever capacity the Brewers may want to use him in. Still possible that we could see him too over the weekend for a tune-up outing, but sounds like some of that is still up in the air a little bit. And then the big one is Brandon Woodruff, who suffered that lat injury. It's a moderate lat strain is what it's been characterized as. The last update was that he had an in-person visit in Dallas on Tuesday with Keith Meister, who was the surgeon who performed his shoulder surgery a couple years ago. He's not officially done for the year. He would be eligible to return from the IL for the NLDS, but moderate lat strain, you're looking at usually at least a month. And a lot of times, this is a very tricky soft tissue injury. Guys do not come back from this very quickly. In fact, if you were to kind of place your bets, so to speak, you're probably better off assuming that the timeline is going to extend even longer than the initial diagnosis than assuming that maybe you can come back a little quicker. So his season is not officially over yet. His regular season is obviously not officially ruled out for the playoffs, but I would not expect to see him pitch again this year.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a bummer, obviously, that's kind of how it's looking like the season will end. I think if there's any shot that people should hope for, it's probably as like a 1-inning reliever, and that would take probably maybe multiple advancements for it to even be within the realm of possibility for the Brewers. So I think it's highly unlikely that you see him again this year. And it's unfortunate. I mean, he had done so much to come back. He had performed really well. We've talked about that a bunch on here. He outperformed what we both expected. I think what most people expected, and rightfully so. I don't think he should have had crazy expectations on him, but he came back and really did the job. But yeah, it sucks to see it end that way. Obviously, it's a little bit different than last time he had this type of injury at the end of the season. You could tell just by the way he talked about the injury this time versus when it happened in 2023, and kind of the mood he had in going into the media availability. Obviously disappointed, but also a little different. He kind of even said like he knew at some point this is just kind of one of those things that tends to pop up with the surgery he had. And he was like, it could have happened in May, June, July, anytime, but it happened to happen now. And I think for him, the way he was talking, he felt like this sucks. It's really not ideal timing at all. But at the same time, I accomplished a lot of things that I wanted to accomplish this season. So it ending like this isn't going to be, the end of the world for him personally, like it was when he had to miss the 2023 postseason. But obviously he wants to be out there for the Brewers. The Brewers would love to have Brandon Woodruff healthy and out there for them. And yeah, it's very unfortunate. It kind of seems like just a continuation of the Brewers seem to have a relatively big injury right before the playoffs every year for a while now. And the McGill news is good news. It sounds like that's pretty likely to have him back, which is good. But then you lose the guy who we talked about. They need a game 3 starter, and this is the reason why. This would have been your game 2 or 3 starter, and now you don't have that. And that really sucks for the Brewers and for Woodruff. So that was easily the worst news and the toughest blow of this week, not the 2-4 record or any of the losses or anything. It was very clearly this news about Woodruff.
So he finishes his regular season, his comeback season, 12 starts, 3.20 ERA, 64 and 2/3 innings in the big leagues for Brandon Woodruff this year. And I know we had talked a lot about leading into the year and kind of on his rehab expectations. I think the quality of his work when he was on the mound exceeded our expectations still by quite a bit. But I know like the workload. I said early in the year, if you get 100 innings out of him as a back of the rotation guy, that's a massive win. I think as the season went along, we kind of
Yeah.
adjusted that to 80, and then he ended up with 64. So, like, reminder, these shoulder injuries are not a joke, guys. Like that, you cannot expect a huge volume of work from someone after they're coming off a shoulder injury. That's just not how this works for a lot of guys. There's so much uncertainty there. And like you mentioned, like even coming back from that, even if the shoulder isn't what flares up, like there can be other stuff that happens. So, but still, I think you still need to consider this a very successful comeback season for Brandon Woodruff, just in terms of proving what he was still able to do once he got back on a mound. But yeah, really tough break for a guy who put in a lot of work, is a pretty big part of this franchise. One of the better pitchers in franchise history, a very big part of that locker room culture as well. So we'll kind of see what happens with him. That does bring us to a question from Andrew that we got. He said, do you think Woodruff has pitched his last game for the Brewers? Would you sign him back? And if so, at what number? How big of a loss is he to their World Series chances? So I don't think he's pitched his last game as a Brewer. I actually, after this, feel pretty good about his odds of coming back. I think there was already going to be a okay chance of it to begin with. He likes it here. The Brewers like him. He's a big part of what they have going on. I don't know if he's really in a position to command a long-term deal again. Certainly not now after he only pitched 60 innings this year. Um, I think it comes down to, how willing are the Brewers to make another commitment. But I would not be shocked if he kind of gets like another pillow type contract similar to what we saw before, where maybe you can work out something like a 1 year with a player option in case that first year doesn't go so great for him of that contract, some kind of arrangement like that, because I do still think he proved that he can be a big piece when he's on the mound. Um, it'll be interesting to see how it goes, but I'm going to put the odds at over 50%, in my opinion, that he's back in Milwaukee on some kind of new arrangement. Uh, as far as loss to their World Series chances, I think there's a difference between starting Brandon Woodruff and potentially having to start Jose Quintana. Now, I do think there are ways that they can line this up where they can figure it out without him. Especially because that he probably wasn't going to work super deep into a lot of games like maybe the Brandon Woodruff of the past. I think that's where it gets a little bit easier to maybe see a path forward. If this were in the past and you were looking at like this is a guy who's bona fide 7 innings almost every time out, that's a little bit different. But in a small sample, could you get from a Chad Patrick or a combination of like Chad Patrick and Robert Gasser what you might have gotten from Brandon Woodruff in the playoffs, this version of Brandon Woodruff? I think you maybe could have. So I think that, it's a loss, obviously, but I think that they can navigate it. You're better off with Brandon Woodruff in your rotation, but there's a way to, I think, come close enough to the results that you could have gotten from him in one postseason. But either way, an unfortunate break for all parties.
Yeah, I'll touch on the second part first. Like, I think it'll take some guys stepping up, similar to how Brandon Woodruff stepped up in 2018 when he was a young pitcher who had done some good things, but not necessarily had like his moment or any real big outings or anything to that point. And he stepped up in the playoffs and made a big impact. Maybe not to that degree. I don't know if any of our pitchers are taking Clayton Kershaw deep in this playoff run, but like you said, I think Patrick, Gasser, even maybe Miz in a future round can be a group that could step up and fill some of the gap there that you're missing with Woodruff. But there was more of a sure thing. Now, it wasn't as sure of a thing as 2019, 2021, those Brandon Woodruffs pre-injury, but it was more of a sure thing than you're going to get for many of these young guys. So in that way, it's definitely unfortunate. But like you said, I think they can make up for it. And on the other part of it, I'm with you. I would lean more towards he has not. In fact, I think if there's a silver lining of this injury for Brewers fans, I actually think the injury may have upped the odds a little bit of him returning moving forward. Just giving it, maybe giving other teams a little bit more pause as they go into the offseason and potentially make offers to Woodruff. But also, like, I think the Brewers were willing to stand by him when he had a major, major shoulder injury coming up that no one knew how he was going to return from it. They're not going to be bothered unless this lat thing becomes a huge, huge deal. And I think from Woodruff's perspective, like, he's pretty well aware of how abnormal that was for the Brewers to offer somebody in his position the amount of money that they offered him to keep him in the organization. I think there's a really good match here. They seem to, obviously, the Brewers love Woodruff. Woodruff has always been really happy in Milwaukee. He talked about how during the rehab, all he wanted to do was get back and pitch for the Brewers again. Like, that was a big part of the goal and everything he was doing. So I would still lean towards it being a reunion again. Not really a reunion, but him staying. And like you said, maybe it's another like 1+1 type of deal. Obviously, there's a $10 million buyout heading into next year. So they're kind of already on the hook for $10 million this offseason for Woodruff's contract. The only thing I'm curious about, I wonder if they would offer the qualifying offer. I don't think so, because I don't think anyone would ever go out and give him more than a year or two in free agency right now, which makes it pretty you wouldn't get much reward even if he did decline and sign somewhere else. So my guess is it's more along the lines of what you talked about, a 1+1, maybe even a 2+1 type of deal where they give him a little bit more security and he gets an opportunity to stay, and it just works out well for everybody. So I would lean that way too. And I hope it's not the last time we saw him pitch. That would be just like it was in 2023. It'd be very unfortunate if that's the way he has to go out as a Brewer. You'd really like to see that. If he does ever leave the Brewers, you'd like to see it end on a higher note than an injury, which it would just be an unfortunate way to end it.
Let's start looking ahead to the NLDS roster. We got a lot of questions about that this week. We'll start with Mitchell, who asked on Twitter, I think the Brewers could get by with only 11 pitchers in the NLDS and carrying an extra pinch runner like Brandon Lockridge. Do you agree?
Are you asking me? Yes. I do agree. We talked about it a little bit last week, actually, Ryan and I did, and I think that was kind of where we settled on that making the most sense. And I think adding a guy like Lockridge would make sense as well, just as a guy who can really run. He's a good base stealer. You haven't really had somebody off the bench who could do that during the regular season, other than when he was on the roster. And we got a separate question that I'll kind of tie in. We didn't put it on here, but like someone asked about potentially keeping Lockridge or Hoskins as, like, if you had to choose between the two of them, you could get the big power bat or you could get the speed. I think I'm choosing the power bat if I have to pick between the two of them, but I don't think the Brewers will need to. I think they can roster two guys. I think they could roster both of them. And in that scenario, I do think Lockridge is somebody that I'm kind of expecting to see on the roster in the NLDS. That might change if they advance, where they don't have, where I would guess they probably do want 12 pitchers if they are in a 7-game series. But in the 5-game, that's kind of what I'm expecting.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if they go that way at all. So we'll find out when the rosters come out. But I would agree with you. I'm expecting to see Brandon Lockridge on that roster. I think he fills kind of those hyper-specific roles off the bench that you can that become more pivotal in a small sample, like one game where you need to win that game, and there's a very specific situation that comes up where you need that speed. Playoffs are it's a good setup for a guy like Brandon Lockridge because you can kind of take advantage more of some of the unique skills that he has. So I'd be shocked if he's not on that roster next week. Michael asked, should the Brewers alter their starting lineups in the NLDS based on the tendencies of the starting pitcher, meaning Ortiz at shortstop and Churio in center for a ground ball heavy pitcher like Priester, and then Andre Monasterio at shortstop and Blake Perkins in center field for a more neutral or fly ball heavy pitcher like Freddie? So I do think we're going to see some version of this. I think in the outfield is where you're going to see it. I do think Perkins is going to start for more of the fly ball pitchers, and then you might kind of mix things up a different way for a ground ball pitcher like Priester. That's probably where you can get away with like Churio in center, Collins in left, and Sal in right. But it does kind of seem like Isaac Collins is starting to fall a little bit out of favor on the pecking order based on, I think, the declining defense has been a pretty big part of that. It was something that Pat Murphy noted on the last homestand that the glove has not been very good. The numbers back it up. The eye test backs it up too. He just hasn't been great out there in left field for a while now. And if that is the case, then yeah, I think you would rather take Blake Perkins, put him in center field, slide Churio over to the left, and then you know that pretty much across the board you have really good defenders in that outfield. I think where this gets interesting is Joey Ortiz's role, and this will kind of tie it back to what I teased earlier in the show. Is he going to start every playoff game at shortstop? I'm still inclined to think he will, regardless of the matchup, because they are still really, really high on the glove. And also the front office just really likes Joey Ortiz. So I'd be a little bit surprised if the front office were to even let Murphy start someone other than Joey Ortiz at shortstop in any of these playoff games. But the bat has been so bad lately that I think you can make an argument for starting Monasterio at short against a fly ball pitcher like Freddie. The other component of this too that I can't really get out of my head is Bryce Terang has been doing a lot of individual work at shortstop, like almost every day for quite some time now, several weeks. He's doing pregame work at short. And I can't help but wonder if that's something that the Brewers kind of have in their back pocket right now. It's not something that they've done in the regular season, but there is a part of me that's wondering if they are preparing for a scenario in which, whether it's some permutation of changing who they want to start, pinch hitting for Ortiz late in the game and sliding things around. Are they preparing for Bryce Terang to potentially play some shortstop in October? I don't know, but I do know that he's been putting in a lot of regular work over there in pregame.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I wonder. You mentioned pinch hitting late in games. I just wonder if the plan might be partially like, hey, if Ortiz comes up in a big spot, even if it's the fourth inning, fifth inning of a playoff game, like, do we take that shot and hit a guy like Bowers or Hoskins or whoever, and then make the change? And maybe the easiest way to do that is not to make two subs. Maybe you have an ability to, put Terang at short and change things up a little bit that way. But yeah, I agree with you. I think he starts. How long he makes it, that I could see changing depending on situation. And apparently he is required to hit if the bases are loaded. So maybe that comes earlier in a game. Like, that's something that he might end up getting hit for, like I said, in the middle innings where you wouldn't normally see a pinch hitter. And then they just deal with, they find that the value that could be gained by having the big hit there is more valuable than what he might add defensively the rest of the game. And that's when they're willing to lessen the defensive impact that you might have at short with a Monasterio. But I think he's going to start. I keep coming back. The only thing that gives me some pause is that I remember Hernan Perez getting starts in the NLCS despite all the options that the Brewers had on that roster. And it's like, so maybe they'd be willing to, because it was against lefties only, and Perez did do decently against lefties back in that time period. But maybe they'd be willing to sacrifice something. But again, that whole team was built differently. That team was built to be a better offense than defense. They had Travis Shaw playing second base. They had a bunch of things going on. Scope was playing some shortstop still that year when he came over. Like, they were willing to sacrifice defense for offense at that point. I don't think this team is as inclined to do that. They haven't been for quite a while, and they don't really have it's not the same. Like, you don't have Monasterio's had a very solid season offensively, but he is not Travis Shaw and Mike Moustakas offensively, where he's going to potentially swing games with power and homers and all that stuff. So the trade-off maybe isn't as positive no matter how you look at it offensively, despite how bad Ortiz has been. And the defense, I think, is still to a point where they view Ortiz as a really, really good defender and Monasterio as a guy who can hold his own at short. And that's a pretty wide gap for them to be willing to give up that defense just for a better bat, no doubt about it. But is it that much better of a bat to make up for the difference in defense? I don't think the Brewers view it as being worth it. And honestly, I don't really either. But again, I think there are times in games where you then have to make that decision. When does it become worth it? And it might be earlier in games than we normally see in the regular season.
Lance asked, what do you think the bullpen looks like for the playoffs, assuming McGill comes back? Fetty, Patrick Myers, Hall, and Rob Z. Who amongst them doesn't make it? I mean, I don't know if you really can project it at this point because they don't know who they're going to be playing. And I think especially when you get into the bullpen, that's where it gets there's a lot of moving parts. If they're playing a team that has a lot of left-handed bats, DL Hall's probably on the roster, Rob Z's probably on the roster. If they're facing a team that has fewer of those bigger lefties, maybe then they change it. And then you also have to make decisions of, okay, who's going to be the guy we roster as kind of last year's Aaron Savali, where he was on the roster in the wild card series for the purpose of eating up some innings if they were behind early in the series. Is Eric Fetty that guy? Is Tobias Myers that guy? Is Chad Patrick that guy? Is DL Hall that guy? Like, they have a lot of ways that they can go here. So this is basically going to be a non-answer, but I think it's really hard to say right now because they don't know what the matchup is, and there's just so many factors that are still floating around right now. Um, yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, I agree. I think if I were to make a guess out of that group, I would say Fetty is most likely to be left off, just because honestly, most of the matchups that they would potentially have in front of them are going to have those lefties in their lineup. If it's the Cubs, it's going to have the PCAs and the Kyle Tuckers of the world. If it's the Padres, they've got Jackson Merrill. They've got we just saw him, Gavin Sheets hitting in the middle of their order. O'Hearn, like they have a bunch of lefties too. So I think either way, whoever the matchup ends up being in the NLDS is probably going to be a decently good matchup for lefty pitchers to make the roster. So my guess would be they would make it. And then if you do advance, there's a pretty good chance it's the Phillies. And we know they have a ton of very good lefty hitters. So it just feels like likely to me that these lefties are going to end up being on the roster, assuming Hall is healthy and ready to go. And out of that group, I think Patrick and Myers have shown more sure fire ability to maybe show some impact in the playoffs, whereas Fetty would probably be more of an innings eater. And I don't know if they would value that above the rest of them. But yeah, that's how I would kind of look at it. And to circle it all back, I mean, Jack is right though. Like it does depend on the matchup. It does depend on who ends up being healthy, obviously, but assuming health for everyone and everything else, that's kind of the way I would look at it.
You're probably right. Fetty probably is the safest bet for someone who's getting left off, because even in a world where you do have maybe a team that he matches up better against somehow, you could probably make a case that there's like 3 guys ahead of him who you would rather have eating innings in a playoff game than Eric Fetty, even in a lower leverage spot. So he's probably largely here to eat innings in the regular season. I'm actually very curious to see how much he pitches this weekend, because I think that might also give you a couple of clues. It helps that they have the bye, so they can kind of reset things a little bit. But generally speaking, if Eric Fetty is pitching twice this weekend under any circumstances, he's probably not on the playoff roster because his workload has been pretty heavy lately and he's been eating some innings. So, that might be a little bit of a clue too, that he's here for the regular season, not really to help out in the playoffs at all, which would not be surprising. But we'll see how it all shakes out. And then there is one more question that we got this week, not pertaining to the playoff roster. But we did get one more question on Twitter. How much can defense be improved for unspectacular athletes? Guys like Andrew Vaughn, Blake Burke, Andrew Fisher. How much can off-season training and reps improve things like footwork, form, and instincts at the age of 23 to 29? Is that cake mostly baked? Same question then, reps for an athlete like Churio in the outfield. So since you're more of the prospect guy, I can kind of pass this off to you. But my only real thought is I think for a lot of guys, the thing you can improve the most is anticipation, which kind of goes back into the instincts thing, like just learning how to read balls, learning how to position yourself, learning how you got to time, especially on the infield, your jump and your first step and all this stuff. Like just reading a lot of factors from the game to kind of make your educated guesses. Okay, where's this ball going to be hit? Like, I got to be ready for this. I think those are the things that you can teach more. I don't know how much you can change the way an athlete moves. So I think you're always going to kind of be working within some level of constraints there, but things like anticipation and instincts, I think that's what can get a lot better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think learning how to time, we talked about it, and it was written about by Kurt and other people throughout the season. Like, part of the issue with some of Joey Ortiz's defense early in the season was a lack of timing on his prep steps and landing on time to move. Like, small things like that can always be worked on, and really is something that can be developed just by getting reps and making sure that you're kind of hammering it home. In terms of footwork stuff, I think that's definitely something you can improve, but there are certain people just have like heavy feet and don't move super well. Like Jack kind of hinted at there, like some guys just aren't going to move very well. So yeah, you can tighten up the footwork a little bit. You can make it a little bit better. You can obviously teach them some of the nitty gritty stuff about, especially playing like a first base or a corner spot or whatever on the infield. But like most of the time, range itself, being able to move, get to balls at a certain length, I think the only thing you can improve in that way is your first step and getting off to a better jump. So it's never going to be, for me, like super noticeable for the not great athletes that you're kind of asking about. Now, Andrew Fisher, you mentioned, they're playing him at third base. He's barely played third base recently. So I think you could absolutely see improvement in a bigger jump because it's such a new position for him. Not really new, but something he hasn't done a lot lately, and especially at a high level. So you might see a big jump at first, and then that still might not be a great defender. And that's kind of where you have to see if he can make some smaller improvements and get better in some of the small things that you're talking about. But for a guy like Churio, that's where you can absolutely see a huge jump defensively. And I still kind of think you're going to at some point in the next couple of years for a guy like Churio. Like, my guess is still that he ends up being the long-term center fielder. If Garrett Mitchell had showed he could stay healthy and maybe a little bit more actual sustainability with the way he hit, then I think he was the best option that could have ended up in center field, because the defense was incredible out there when he's been healthy. He's very, very fast. He's obviously used to the spot. Like, I think ideally that would have been the guy who ended up in center. But I do think Churio is going to end up being a very good athlete. And for him, it is getting reps. It's honestly, when I watch a guy like him, I think it's more just him trusting himself and trusting his reads more than anything else, because he actually seems to get decent jumps and then like not go after it super hard because he doesn't think he got a good enough read on it. He kind of second guesses himself halfway through. That's the stuff that you can work on, though. Like, that's the stuff that takes reps, that takes just getting used to it and maybe just a little more confidence in what you're seeing out there. At the same time, like, there are really good athletes who are bad defenders, and it just never comes and clicks for them. It's just a really hard thing for me. This is a super player dependent, player specific thing. And I think you can make small incremental changes and improvements to any player by working with them and figuring things out. But I don't think it's honestly incredibly tied to their athletic ability. I think it's more tied to just things that they already are good at that can be outside of athleticism. Some guys just naturally read the ball off the bat really well. They see the ball, they see a swing, and they can read like, oh, that's early. And their first step is already taking a direct step in the direction of where an early swing would hit the ball. And there are guys who are crazy fast who can't read the ball at all, but they're going to catch stuff that the slower guys wouldn't catch just because they can make up for it on a higher ball. Like, there's just so much that goes into it. It's really hard to say. And I really do think it ends up coming down to the specific player every time. But it's a good question. I just think most of it's kind of, by the time they're in professional baseball, really the big leagues, outside of the super young guys like Churio, who just don't have the experience that a lot of them have, most of them have already garnered all that experience. They've played the position so long. They've done so many things. Outside of position changes, I don't think you see much improvement from anybody in terms of like big jumps defensively. Caleb Durbin is a good example of a position change where it looked bad to start. It did not look very comfortable at third. And because it was a new position, he had a big jump he could make because it was something he was still learning. and he did. And we haven't really revisited that. I think we were both skeptical of the numbers early on, but he genuinely looks like a very solid defender at third base now, which is a huge credit to him and the Brewers in terms of the development for him there. But that to me is where you're going to see stuff more than anything else is learning a new position where it looks bad at first and then they get way better. But if it's a spot they've played for a long time, I think by the time they're this age, that's, to use your wording, I think that is pretty much a case of like the cake is pretty much mostly baked. You're not really going to see huge incremental improvement from anybody defensively. I think offense is different, but obviously this is a defense question, and I think that's kind of where I would end up landing on that.
Well, there is no minor league sandbox this week because the minor league regular season is over. Spencer's very sad about that, but he will have some AFL updates in a few weeks. So the sandbox is coming back. It's just not here for this week. We're pretty much transitioning fully into playoff mode here now. So that's going to take up kind of the structure of the show, obviously, over these next couple weeks here. But we will be back just in time to head into the NLDS because game 1 is next Friday, and that's when our next episode is coming out. So we'll have a more official roster projection for all of you guys at that point next week because we should know who the Brewers are facing, and then we can kind of draft up our rosters a little more in depth as we did last year leading into the playoffs. We'll have all that stuff for you, and should be a good show. We'll see what happens over this final weekend here of the regular season, but more than anything, it's going to be getting the pieces to fall into place here as the Brewers get ready for finally getting back to the NLDS because they've secured that first round bye. So we'll have all of that to break down, a lot of looking ahead next week on the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Thank you all for listening.